Hey y'all, it's entry number 17 of this offseason series where we discuss a different player's fantasy value each day as a group. We are another day closer to the start of the 2022 NFL season. Each day we'll drop a name, go through some positives and some concerns of their fantasy profile, and then I'll give my personal opinion at the end. Today's discussion will be on Amari Cooper, wide receiver, Cleveland Browns. We'll start with the positives from Amari Cooper's fantasy profile. To start, let's talk about how he's a clear top wide receiver for the Browns in 2022. The Browns have some talent at running back with Nick Chubb, Kareem Hunt, and D'Ernest Johnson, and at tight end with David Njoku and Harrison Bryant. But at wide receiver, they are a little more shallow looking, and Amari Cooper is looking like the clear top target. Being the top receiving target on the team means that Cooper should see a decent workload in 2022. The other thing I really like about Amari Cooper's fantasy profile is his year-to-year consistency. In 5 of his first 7 seasons, Amari Cooper has had at least 70 receptions, 1,000 receiving yards, and 5 receiving touchdowns. He's played in 108 of a possible 113 regular season games, or 95.56% in his career, which may make him more trustworthy than other wide receiver options. Moving on to some of the concerns with Amari Cooper. To start, let's talk about his head coach, Kevin Stefanski, and his lower pass volume offenses in the past. Over the course of his 51-game career as an offensive play caller, Kevin Stefanski's offenses have averaged just 30.18 passing attempts, 225.53 passing yards, and 1.55 passing touchdowns per game, which is well below the league averages the past few years. His entire wide receiver room has averaged just 9.04 receptions on 14.55 targets for 128.45 receiving yards and 0.76 receiving touchdowns per game, which is one of the worst marks among active play callers. These past trends don't bode well for Cooper in 2022, especially since he's coming from one of the more wide receiver friendly offenses in the league with the Dallas Cowboys. Another major concern with Amari Cooper's fantasy profile is the projected 2022 QB situation in Cleveland. As of right now, it doesn't appear likely that Deshaun Watson will be available for a majority of the NFL season with his current legal situation. Baker Mayfield was just traded from the Cleveland Browns to the Carolina Panthers. Because of all this, it seems likely that Jacoby Brissett ends up starting for the Browns in a good chunk of the games in 2022. Brissett has served as a starter in the past. In 2017, Brissett averaged just 17.3 completions on 29.3 passing attempts for 193.6 passing yards and 0.81 passing touchdowns per game. In 2019, he averaged just 18.1 completions on 29.8 passing attempts for 196.1 passing yards and 1.20 passing touchdowns per game, according to Pro Football Reference. Having a below-average quarterback makes it more difficult for Amari Cooper to score fantasy points. Some additional thoughts on Amari Cooper. During the 2021 season, Amari Cooper was WR26 in standard with 134.5 total fantasy points or 9.0 fantasy points per game, WR27 in half PPR formats with 168.5 total fantasy points or 11.2 fantasy points per game, and WR27 in full PPR formats with 202.5 total fantasy points and 13.5 fantasy points per game. In 2020, Amari Cooper was WR19 in standard with 144.8 total fantasy points, 9.1 fantasy points per game, WR16 in half PPR with 190.8 total fantasy points or 11.9 fantasy points per game, and WR15 in full PPR formats with 236.8 total fantasy points and 14.8 fantasy points per game in total fantasy points. In half PPR formats during the 2021 season, Amari Cooper had 4 out of 15 games with 0 to 5 fantasy points, 4 out of 15 games with 5 to 10 fantasy points, 4 out of 15 games with 10 to 15 fantasy points, 1 out of 15 games with 15 to 20 fantasy points, 1 out of 15 games with 20 to 25 fantasy points, and 1 out of 15 games with over 30 fantasy points according to fantasy data. Red zone usage. Amari Cooper has seen 8 red zone targets in 2015, 17 red zone targets in 2016, 11 red zone targets in 2017, 9 red zone targets in 2018, 9 red zone targets in 2019, 15 red zone targets in 2020, and 17 red zone targets in 2021, according to NFL Savant. 2021 was his best season for red zone usage, but he has still never led his team in red zone targets, which makes it seem unlikely for him to get double-digit touchdowns in a season. Yards after the catch. According to Pro Football Reference, in 2018, Amari Cooper had 415 yards after the catch. In 2019, he had 278 yards after the catch. In 2020, he had 413 yards after the catch. And in 2021, he had 235 yards after the catch. Personal opinion. As of early July 2022, Amari Cooper was going off the board as WR26, about pick 70 overall, on ESPN, and WR20, about pick 59 overall, on Yahoo. This still seems a little high for him, given the current likelihood that Jacoby Brissett starts the majority of games for the Browns in 2022. At his current draft cost, I probably won't be getting many shares of Amari Cooper. For each of these entries, we will include a link to a charitable cause or foundation. Today's link is for Amari Cooper's My Cause My Cleats in 2020, which was for the Literacy Lab. Here's a link to that organization below. And that's it for today's entry. If you have a player that you'd like to see covered in the video format of the A Player Day series, drop a comment below.